of course, it's not all that simple. The problems are very complex. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created acute pressures on, of course, the public budget in terms of spending on humanitarian needs, medical needs, and this is coming on top of course, the dislocation of the people, infrastructure destruction, ecological contamination, and landmines, just to name a few. These add to already existing past damages since the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Of course, pre-existing problems and the pandemic, last but not least. So we need a comprehensive and urgent solution to all these, and this roundtable and the book are discussing concrete policies for sustainable rebuilding of Ukraine in terms of fiscal and monetary measures, in terms of the role of public sector, the role of private sector, civil society and the state, in terms of all domains of economic, social and environmental policies. This is what we understand from deep sustainability. The aim is to support the Ukrainian citizens, residents, and their groups and representatives in their efforts towards the country's recovery with this deep sustainability understanding. This roundtable is a continuation of the work that the speakers and other people in the room today have been doing. It does represent a collaborative step, hopefully towards what the organizers call recipient-informed policy proposals. I myself look forward to the debate and future collaboration, and in my words, what I would call a green, caring, just recovery in Ukraine and a just peace process for Ukraine. So without further ado, I would very much like to invite our own Yuliya Yurchenko to introduce the panel, to chair the panel. Yuliya, the floor is yours, and thanks very much for organizing and being with us.
Thank you very much, Özlem. It's an honor to... This a home for the last 10 years. Thank you all very much for being here with us today on the eve of the Ukraine Recovery Conference 2023. I'm really glad, and of course I'm worried about what will come out of this conference, a lot will be decided, but I'm also glad that we're having a forum where we will be discussing already an existing wonderful output of what needs to be happening for Ukraine, and not only to have progressive, human-orientated, environmental survival-orientated recovery. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing, and I'm looking forward to you hearing from our wonderful audience online. There are many people watching the stream, and there are many people in the room, and I'm looking forward to what will come from this discussion. There are leaflets that you have seen on the advert for this event, and those of you who are in person here will have them on your desks. You have the lineup of our speakers, and I want to jump into our discussion right away without any further ado, because I would rather spend this time discussing practical, important policy and otherwise matters. I will, at this point, invite Edward Knudsen to speak first. Originally, I wanted to get our editor, Optenhögel, to speak first, but Edward cannot stay with us too long. So I will invite him to speak first, and then Uwe, I will invite you to contribute, and we will continue with other speakers. Some of who contributed, like myself and Bogdan, to the book, and Uwe, of course, and others whose work resonates with what this project is about and with the wider project of FAPS is about. And we have a representative of APS here, Andriy Kornichuk, who's also of Ukrainian extraction, and will tell us more about APS after we've had the presentation. Please peruse the books. They're free for you to take. One-off, wonderful offering. But now I'm going to pass the floor over to you, Ted. Please take it away.
Great. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. That's great. Well, thank you so much to all the organizers, and thank you for accommodating me time-wise. I actually think my contribution coming at this point might be of use to the panel in terms of the flow of it, because rather than looking at some of the actual specifics of the post-war reconstruction, what my contribution to the edited volume looks at is some of the preconditions and the tensions in actually reaching peace in the first place. And so just a bit of background on what I wrote here. I call it the Ukraine ceasefire trilemma. When I originally wrote this, actually it was published exactly a year ago with Encompass Europe as a short blog post, and then Laszlo kindly asked me to expand it into this book, obviously published now. And what I did in the piece in the book is expand upon the original and ask if what I originally posed as a trilemma of outcomes still held. And to give a bit of background on that, what I said is my sort of three points of the trilemma. So if you think about that, right, there's three conditions, and you can only choose two of them. And one I described as domestic acceptability within Ukraine. The other was alignment with EU interests. And then the third is military feasibility. And so what I posited then was how it looked was you could only really have any two of those. So just to run through it, you could have something that was domestically acceptable within Ukraine and aligned with EU interests, which would of course be a total Ukrainian victory. However, that has the fault of not being feasible militarily. And again, I wrote this about a year ago. We could argue how that's changed, but there's mixed reports of the current counteroffensive. But I do believe that that tension still holds, where what an absolute victory in expelling Russia from all Ukrainian territory for now is not military feasible. The second option then would be the combination of alignment with EU interests and feasible militarily. And that would be a ceasefire with probably, in some cases, significant territorial losses. However, that has the problem of, and I still believe, not being domestically acceptable within Ukraine. There's a lot of rightly so mobilized nationalist sentiments in the country that probably would not tolerate that and would not accept a government that accepted those losses. And then third, you could have a combination of military feasibility and domestic acceptability within Ukraine, which would be a long war of attrition, as I called it. That would probably be not aligned with EU interests because of Europe's obviously proximity and a lot of the costs that they have to bear of this ongoing war. But what I identified due to the stronger constraints in those first two scenarios is that what could happen is what I deemed a long war by default, where actually, because Ukraine is good at holding its own, it can push back on some territory. Maybe Russia will then push back again, with Western aid, and wants to keep up the fight. Citing some polling here, Ukrainians, again, I think understandably, are very, very willing to continue this fight for now. Is that you might end up by default in this long war of attrition, and I think to some extent that's what we're seeing now. And I just pose that I pose these tensions to show that while I think it is very excellent that everyone's debating the fate of post-war Ukraine now, as for example, in the Second World War, leaders meeting at Bretton Woods before the war was over. Obviously, you don't want to wait till hostilities end before deciding the economic game. But what I want to emphasize in this, and maybe it's not a terribly hopeful argument, but I think it's one that needs to be pointed out, is that it's not clear to me, based on the political and military constraints that we face, that this war will necessarily end anytime soon. Like I said, it's a bit of a note of caution, and not to start the event on a kind of sour note there. But I think something that we all need to keep in mind is absolutely preparing for the future, absolutely preparing for the economic reconstruction of Ukraine, because that will be vital at some point. but also keeping in mind the task at hand and the support that Ukraine needs and the actual constraints in the way of reaching that peace deal in the first place. And so I won't belabor it too much. It gets into a lot greater detail. I would encourage everyone, if you have time, to read the chapter in the book where I get into more detail about this, as well as what could change and what could actually undermine what I identify as a kind of ironclad logic in this trilemma. And like I said, I identify conditions under which that might not hold. I don't want to be absolutist about my framework, but I think a lot of the basic tenets of that do hold and are worth thinking about as we wonder when some of these economic plans might be able to be implemented. Like I said, just maybe that could be some good groundwork and good intro comments for the rest of the panel. And I appreciate you having me so much. So thanks everyone, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Ted. That was really important, interesting, and necessary indeed. And I guess because you cannot stay with us long, I just wanted to throw a very quick question at you, because you mentioned the European Union interest alignment in this security trilemma. I was also curious to invite you to comment very briefly on where is beyond EU interests, because of course there are international organizations, military alliances, trade alliances, all sorts, right? So if you could just, from your expertise, also tell us how you see that dimension play out in this context. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I should just say I chose that original framing about EU interests due to, originally who the piece was for, Encompass Europe, a kind of EU-centered publication. And then also, FEP's operating within the EU. But of course, I don't mean that parochially in the sense that EU interests are all that matters. Just thinking about for an EU policy audience, from their perspective, what to expect. And I would say in terms of the various interests here that become very important, I guess I'll just briefly highlight, what I think is the most important is this potential transatlantic divergence of interest, which I think we're seeing little bits of here and there. And since the war started, a lot of people have really pointed out, this is such a great moment for transatlantic unity. We're finally kind of, with Biden being back in office and his sort of America is back thing, and NATO then kind of regaining relevance. I think there's been a lot of fanfare and a lot of kind of celebration of transatlantic unity, and that's all good and fine in a lot of ways. However, the long-term risk here, and I think, like I said, I think we're seeing little signs of it, is that for the U.S. in a lot of ways, geostrategically, this has played out relatively beneficial for them. They're able to send a bunch of old stocks of mostly Cold War equipment in order to erode the military capacity of one of their greatest rivals. Meanwhile, Europe is left to bear a lot of the higher energy costs and will be certainly bearing a lot of the reconstruction costs. And so there is a risk here that what I deem here as EU interests, and I talk a bit about this in the piece, can be separated from U.S. interests, and then that poses a lot of other greater risks for other kind of for other sorts of global problems. And as well as the rest of the world, you see obviously a hesitance to engage in some of the sanctions and arms shipments that the developed, mostly global North has done. Again, that's another type of divergence of interest, with obviously potentially rising food costs, also rising energy costs, and other things like that. So while I chose the focus on EU interests in this piece, of course, I wouldn't want to ignore other interests. And actually, I think a good follow-up on this would be actually identifying where EU interests diverge from other interests and what actually kind of risks those divergences may pose in the future. So yeah, thanks so much for the question.
Thank you so much for this illuminating answer, because indeed there are quite a lot of different interests, and it's not possible in one piece to talk about all of them. That can't be expected of anyone, but I wanted to hear your thoughts and kind of how you place these things. I think it's important in this conversation. I'm going to pass the floor over now to Optenhögel, who's the vice president, for the Foundation of European Progressive Studies. We're really sad that Uwe cannot be with us in person today. the gods of transport didn't help us. Maybe we can remove the spotlight from here.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I've put you on the bigger screen together with Bogdan, so we can see you better. And you are really missed, but I'm glad that at least we can get you here virtually. So technology has its benefits sometimes when old school infrastructure for various reasons.
Yeah, well, that was the case today.
Yeah, I'm going to pass the floor to you. So please. No, take the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Özlem and Yuliya, for your introductions. I was physically already traveling, sitting in the train at Cologne Airport, at Cologne Central Station, when there was a technical problem with the train. So sometimes I became a victim of the growing unreliability of the German railroad, which, by the way, is a late effect of conservative transport politics, but that's a different topic. Let me first very briefly thank our co-organizers who have organized this with us, the University of Greenwich and also LSE, the Conflict and Civicness Research Group. I want to say one word concerning the book and then make a point concerning reconstruction. I mean, the book, you have it there and might have a look at it, might take it with you. The book is an attempt to take stock after a year of war. What becomes clear when you see the book is that we can already draw a couple of lessons from the conflict as we have observed it over time. One lesson is certainly that wars involving great powers can no longer be contained regionally in a globalized world. The international repercussions of the war are multifold, and this is reflected in the book with articles on different subjects where you can see the repercussions of it. The second thing is, which also comes across in the book, I think it becomes very clear that Europe needs a new Eastern policy. This is not only Europe that needs it, but also Germany, of course, but Europe as a whole certainly also needs a new Eastern policy. And the third point, which I think has become clear over the last 15, 18 months, is that progressive forces have distinguished themselves in this difficult year by going beyond international solidarity and reconciling it with two further objectives. And these further objectives were fair distribution of the costs of war within our societies and an avoidance of unnecessary escalation in tandem with simultaneous preparations for peace and reconstruction. I think in this regard, progressives have been highly responsible in regard to the repercussions of the war, more so than maybe other political forces. And a fourth point I wanted to address regarding the articles in the book, and that brings me then to my comment on recovery and reconstruction. That is that it becomes clear in the book in various articles, especially from Yuliya, also from Bogdan Ferenc, from Andrei Kornichuk, that what is needed is an inclusive recovery which enables prosperity and democracy at the same time, but this time a recovery for the many and not for the few. And this leads me to my point regarding reconstruction. I think we should part from the notion that Ukraine does not only have a politically destructed, also to recover as a society, economy, and a state. At the same time, the post-war moment offers the opportunity of a second, involuntary, obviously, transformation, distinct from the first one after independence in the 1990s. And from a social democratic perspective, this chance should be taken to correct the errors made in the 90s when neoliberal doctrines prevailed in the economy and in politics. At this time, reconstruction and recovery should be organized with the participation and to the benefit of the entire population. Now, I think this is something one can easily share, but it will be very hard to put a perspective like this in practice. Because if reconstruction starts, it's big money rolling, and big money is normally spent with the state, among states, and by state agencies. So if you want to involve trade unions or non-governmental organizations, NGOs, it's difficult to have them participate in what was established so far as reconstruction processes and experiences. And then I think we also have to admit that the progressive forces in Ukraine before the war have not been very strong. So to me, there is the question, how can progressives benefit from lessons the war is teaching us? High solidarity in the population. So this would be something Bogdan and the other Ukrainian friends will certainly think about a lot. But the key point, in my opinion, is that reconstruction can be shaped by progressive thoughts and by social democrats and socialists in Brussels. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the reconstruction will be paid by Europe. So the reconstruction design will be largely made in Brussels. And there, the socialists and democrats have a strong group in the European Parliament. They have commissioners. They are well enrooted. And I think this should be a strategic approach in Brussels to influence the EU reconstruction plans and designs from a progressive perspective. And this is something where FEPS can play a role, obviously, because we are in Brussels. We are very well connected in Brussels. And I think we should try to connect you people from Ukraine, the Ukrainian progressives, with the Brussels bubble or the Brussels world, but to concretely influence on the design of reconstruction. That is my main point. So I promote this a little bit when I'm talking on panels and so on. I do see a chance of a second transition, second transformation, which really has to be different from the first one. Not only your country, but many others in Central and Eastern Europe have experienced in the 90s, and we all know in what structures this resulted. Maybe a last word to FEPS, but I will be very, very short on this because Andrei Kornichuk is with you, so if you have questions, you can later ask him. I mean, we are the think tank of the Progressive Family in Brussels, but we are a member organization. We have at the moment approximately 45 regular members and 20-something observer members. And we organize together with these members different kinds of activities in Brussels, but also in the respective countries. And we look forward to work also with you in Ukraine when the war allows for that, and we can do things there again. I think I'll leave it to that. Maybe a personal note in the very end. I do have a long relationship to the transition countries because in the 1990s, I was responsible in Friedrich Ebert Stiftung to set up the office network the Ebert Stiftung has in the meantime in Central Eastern Europe and also Central Asia and Caucasus. So for me, it is really partly a very sad and memorable re-encounter with the countries, especially with Ukraine, which I visited a lot in the 90s. And my latest visit there was a year before the war broke off. So I think we all wish for a peace that Ukraine can stand, and then we come to recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uwe. Very important points and very touching points. I'll be speaking to the issues of fair distribution of costs myself, and you know that it's dear to my heart, but also on a little bit of a humorous note. You see, the disruption of your travel yet again reminds us how important it is to invest in infrastructure and create all of these maintenance jobs that are actually low carbon, sustainable, keep cash in the community and keep our essential services running. So all of these arguments are all around us. Now I'm going to call Tasha Lomonosova from Cedos and from Sotsialny Rukh to speak, also not least for a bit of a gender balance, to dilute the highly esteemed company of expert men. Tasha, please take it away. And
thank you.
Yours.
Yes, so I represent the Ukrainian think tank Cedos. We work on the social development. We have topics education, housing policy, employment, and I'm delighted to see references on our research in the book. That's always nice to see that we product knowledge that is interesting for the colleagues. I also think that it's important to have such work as have been done for this book, because I believe that there is really a lack of knowledge production and lack of collaborative knowledge production. No, I think we hear you.
So for the online,
they hear me.
I think for the recording it's probably.
Sure. I think that it works.
Does it work?
No. I think it does.
Test the green. Test the green.
It is green. It is green. It's usually a bad idea.
They can hear us.
They can hear us.
don't touch it again. Yeah.
That's
Don't press the button again.
Yeah, that is just okay. So yeah, I was talking about that. I think it's nice that you have this book, because I think there is a significant lack of the knowledge production from the progressive side on the recovery and collaborative knowledge production on the recovery, because we have a lot, like a wide discussion on the recovery and how the recovery should happen, but I think this discussion is not always politically and ideologically balanced. And in my speech, I would maybe drop some points regarding the recovery. It has been mentioned in the beginning, in the keynote, that we need a green, caring recovery. And I think that the word care is something that's not usually appear also in the discussion on the recovery and in the recovery plans in general. In the Ukraine, in general, in Ukrainian language, in Ukrainian terminology, Ukrainian legislative terminology, there is no such word as care in general. There is social protection and different services you can receive, for example, social services. But I think that the humans in general deserve care, not only services. And in many discussions I have been attending in the last months, you know, there's all of these discussions are talking about how resilient Ukrainian society is, how strong Ukrainian society is. But well, it's right. Ukrainian society is strong, but I think that we need to unpack this resilience in a way if we talk about the recovery, because the the society is strong, but the human being is fragile, and we should admit it. Whether those human beings are on the front line, or they are working in the care sector, or in the healthcare sector, and we need to somehow to address it. Because when we talk about unpacking the resilience, I mean all this, real life situations of who make the streets clean, who care about the people, because there are a lot of events now where people from the foreign countries are visiting Ukraine and saying in general Ukraine is strong because you see no rubbish on the street, you see society working, kids are going to schools and so on, but someone is behind it. And I think that of course it's like, I think it's important to ask us the question, like I don't want to be pessimistic and talk about when the war is going to end, because it's, I don't know, it's a hard question, but I would rather ask the question how long people can handle it and stay strong and resilient. And I think that there's not so much discussion about it in Ukraine and abroad. And first, it's important to add this caring perspective into the recovery in general. But second, I think that Ukrainians deserve care now. And there are a lot of issues with, for example, the salaries of the public workers being frozen, but they continue their work. And they cannot wait another 5 years when I'm not telling that we're gonna have a war for 5 years. I'm staying optimistic, but when we're gonna implement the recovery plans, what will happen in these 5 years? Maybe all these workers in the care sector will, make other life decisions and join the care sector in UK or in other countries. So I think we need to address this situation now, because also talking about security, I'm not the specialist on the security, but as a social scientist, I can talk a lot about the social cohesion and security inside the society. And I think that if we not address these problems of helping the people to stay resilient, we will have the problem inside Ukrainian society, which will not be able to handle it anymore, and it will create a great danger, like it would endanger our possibility to fight with Russia. So I think this is a topic that actually could be addressed only from progressive side, at least as we see now. I don't know, again, I'm trying to be optimistic. But I think I will stop here, and I will be really interested to discuss it more, because I really relate to what Uwe has said about the possibilities of the officials in Brussels and other centers of decision making from the social democratic and leftist perspective, actually to bring some other perspectives into the recovery discussions. And we as Ukrainian think tanks and institutions, of course, will be delighted to add our thoughts on this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tasha. Indeed, the social aspect of sustainable recovery is not something that as frequently as it should takes center stage, because I've been studying the recovery plans since they were unveiled in the first plans last year, and there are rather broad, and these sort of have to be broad aims. Some means I have a bit of an issue with, but the fundamental thing is who will do the recovery. You need workers for that, and the dislocation of the labor force has been extremely significant, and attracting people to come back will not necessarily be as easy as it may seem. There's been an outflow of producing skilled, highly skilled, low skilled. I have a problem with that terminology, but that's what we've got. Labor force, but there is a lot of talk about supporting entrepreneurship. And if everybody is an entrepreneur, who's the worker? You cannot have 10 millions of sole traders what you need is to operate a railway. It simply doesn't work like that. You need a socio-economic system of different levels of units, different size, with different skills, working together in a coordinated manner towards a certain sense of direction, but also, of course, understanding that the needs and demands are kind of, they can change. So there should be that flexibility inbuilt. And the way that the official plan is being treated is that it's being treated as a document that is evolving, and it should be, the war isn't over to begin with, right? The kind of financing streams aren't secured. There are pledges, but there aren't quite disbursements. There are all sorts of, there is all sorts of dynamism, to put it the most English way I can, to this situation. But at the same time, there needs to be a coordinated sense of direction. If we are really moving towards sustainability, then where is the social dimension of it? Where is talk about wages? Where is talk about social services provision and the rest of it, right? But we'll talk about this more today as well. But at this point, I want to pass the word to Luke Cooper, who's the director of the Peace Rep Ukrainian program at LSC, and a lot of other different hats you're wearing. So whichever one else you want to wear today, please do tell us. But at this point, I'm passing the floor to you. Thank you very much. And Luke has done some really excellent writing since the war started on the importance of war economy, for example, which we don't see, do we?
Thanks, Yuliya. Yeah, well, I'm also very involved, as some of you know, in a campaign group called Another Europe is Possible, and I started, unlike Yuliya and unlike campaigns like the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign that formed in 2014, I would be part of the guilty left that didn't respond quickly and fast enough to the first Russian invasion of Crimea and part of the annexation of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine. So I think last year, before the war and in the build-up to war, we started doing, as Another Europe is Possible, these No to War peace assemblies, which were trying to mobilize a pan-European network in opposition to Putin's invasion. And in some ways, setting up a research program at LSE was like a continuation of the activism that we had already started, because it's an unusual research program in some respects, because we formed it with explicit goals, action-orientated goals, that we said our aim of our research hopefully is to provide analyses and evidence and data that is useful to protecting Ukraine's democratic institutions and its territorial integrity. So we're really pleased to be a part of this conversation tonight. And I'd say where our research program is that we set up is part of a broader research program on war and conflict in the 21st century called Peace Rep. And I want to argue here, perhaps in contrast to Edward's initial talk, I don't know if he's still here, but I want to talk just in the few minutes I have about the difference between what's happening in Ukraine analytically and other sites of war and conflict in the 21st century, and what some of the political conclusions or practical conclusions that might follow from that distinction. The first thing I would say is that there's this, I would argue that there's a danger that the notion of a long war becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we should be conscious of that danger when we're discussing the issue of a long war. It's a tempting prognosis for at least two reasons. One is that Ukraine has already been in a long war with Russia, i.e. the first Russian invasion of 2014 and its aftermath. In many respects, this war is a continuation of the first one. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that we've got lots of case studies and lots of examples of wars globally that become really difficult to stop, and that become situations of intractable violence. There's one happening right now in Sudan, of course. We're fighting for the first time, although it's been in a state of intractable violence for many, many years, but fighting has now come to the center, to Khartoum, and it's a situation where a series of different rebel groups in different elites see violence as a political and economic accumulation strategy. So this becomes really hard to stop, where you get loads of different actors, non-state actors, that have an interest in continuing to prosecute violence in one way or another. We've seen that in Yemen, we see that in Syria, we see that to some degree in Somalia too, all places in Afghanistan, of course, and for many years as well. So I think where I want to counsel caution, though, on that analysis is that there's a clear distinction between the Russia-Ukraine war, especially how it exists in 2022, 2023, and those other situations of intractable violence. This is a high-intensity interstate war, and if you're familiar with Clausewitz, I think you could see it as a classic Clausewitzian war in at least two respects. The first is that it's defined by clear political aims on either side. One side, Russia, aim very clear, it's authoritarian ethnic nationalism, imperialism, etc. The other side is defined also by a clear political aim of defending democracy, territorial integrity, etc. It's also, I think, Clausewitzian in the sense that you might have this idea that you might know of this idea that Clausewitz saw wars as inherently escalatory, the kinds of wars that he was analysing. And I think, and I'm afraid that that's right in this sense, this war too, because it's a total war between two sides, where both sides are prepared to mobilise as many resources as they can to defeat the other. And if we're happy with that analysis, then it does lead to a practical conclusion, and that is that there's no high intensity conventional wars that go on forever. All high intensity conventional wars in history that have retained that character, that haven't broken down into a situation of intractable violence, have come to an end. We might think of the Iran-Iraq war. We can think of many other conventional wars. The Second World War, of course, that fits that analysis. So then I think some of the whole discussion around recovery taking place this week in the Ukraine Recovery Conference maybe could do with some help, if you like, from that analysis, I would say, because, basically you get lots of rather fantastic discussions about future recovery. And yes, they're very neoliberal, as many of you in this room will know, but they're also just very cut off from the practical needs of Ukraine right now, which is to expel Russia and win the war and mobilize as many societal resources as possible for that clear political aim. And so if we're thinking about, again, keeping with this analysis, what kind of risks does it pose to the Ukrainian side and what scenarios exist? So the scenario that I think I would draw and put forward isn't this long war scenario. I'm not saying it's impossible. I just don't think it's the most likely one. I think if you're comfortable with the idea that this is a total war, then what you should expect to happen is that at a certain point, maybe this year, maybe next year, one of the sides will break. And that side might be the Russian side, and the break will come maybe through perhaps this counteroffensive, we hope, and that Ukraine and Russia will be unable to defend its line, and that will force a political change in Moscow. It's also, and this isn't what I want, obviously, but it's also possible, perfectly possible, that could happen on the Ukrainian side. And I think its effects would be similar. It would force political change in Kiev. Zelensky would be forced, say, to resign, and the chair of the Rada would perhaps take over and try to negotiate an armistice agreement, but he might face that, and it is a he, that it might face the problem that Putin would go for Kiev, or there's a collapse of the state. So I would put forward those scenarios actually in this conflict, partly because both sides are really fighting in this high intensity way for that finish. And then the point I would end on around the Ukraine Recovery Conference is that really, Ukraine is reluctant at the moment to organise its entire economy around in a total war style fashion. And that means reorganising its economy in a way analogous to the Allies in the Second World War. It means trying to calibrate your entire productive sector to the needs of your armed forces to win the war. And this has led to what we can say is, I think, a real vulnerability of Ukraine now. Isn't on the front line, it's on the home front. It's in the severe economic crisis that continues to persist in its domestic economy. That takes the form of somewhere between 1 in 5 people being unemployed, real wages falling in 2022 by about 11%, sucking demand out of the economy. And what the state needs to be doing in that situation is injecting demand into the economy and using the need to fight the war to get the economy going. And so the risks that that Ukraine will continue to face, I think, in that context, is at the moment its economy is incredibly dependent on large financial flows from its partners and allies. These were equivalent, so if you to 26% of the deficit, the spending deficit of the Ukrainian state was 26% last year, once you exclude the grants and aids that it's getting. So it's a huge injection of financial resources. Some of that is aid, but some of that is also debt. And if the economy recovers this year, and Ukraine to some degree, even a modest recovery, that might lead to a rise in imports into the Ukrainian economy, deepening the fact that it's got this kind of, it's on the verge potentially of a balance of payments crisis, where your international obligations are much greater than the money you have coming in. And so to offset that, and that the real risk then becomes political, is like a Trump White House in the 2024-2025 problem, because America is injecting lots of direct aid directly into the Ukrainian budget at the moment to offset some of those risks. So that's the point, I guess, I will end on, because at the moment, and I've talked about this in an article coming out on the IPS journal that's linked to FES this week. Ukraine has a job to do, I would say, in insourcing the war economy, growing your domestic productive capacity, growing your taxation revenue to build a war economy that is less dependent on external support. And if it does that, then it means that Ukraine will retain more sovereignty over its war aims in the conflict and will be better able to prosecute this Clausewitzian war.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Absolutely excellent point. And I think the issue of security is extremely important one, and the nature of warfare is extremely important one to talk about, because I think sometimes, I was thinking as you were talking, because I'm so bogged into the political economy of things that sometimes, the kind of, that the war needs to be over for certain things to happen, and what can be done while the war is still going on. But then these kind of matters of, wait a minute, where is this pragmatically in the planning, right? I feel like still amongst those who are in charge of talking about recovery and designing it, there is almost a sense of denial that you do not automatically get to the end of this war. There is still this talk about, we're still preserving the market economy. No, you can't do market economy, and it is not really working properly, is it, right now? Why should so much humanitarian and military equipment, non-armed equipment, be supplied and taken care of by volunteers and donations? From housing to internally displaced persons, to buying medicines or boots for the military. And why is Ukrainian army issued uniform being sold on Ukrainian equivalent of eBay, if it's military only? Amongst many other examples of similar stuff. So, and the government, there are people in the government who talk about taxing the organizations that collect donations for the front, but they're not talking about wealth tax. Instead of bringing industries of oligarchs under governmental control, some of which had no business being privatized in the first place, such as energy enterprises, for example. This also makes me very unpopular, this kind of talk in all sorts of forums. But those are very important questions. We know from history that if you do not bring key industries under coordinated control of the government, and then you cannot support the military effort. The budget planning and projections, if you look at them, it seems as if they expect that the donation streams in their volume as they are will continue indefinitely, and we know that that's not going to happen either. So what kind of denial does exist around all of these plans? And when will the reality kick in? Because at some point, those who are sending donations and aid are going to get a bit bored of doing that. So that is something that I am very worried about. Because if you still have what in Ukraine we call the Monaco battalion of oligarchs and wealthy politicians who have fled the country despite being subject to conscription movement limitations, while usually the poorer people, their bodies are fighting at the front and their donations, the last pennies, hryvnias, kopiki, are funding, bearing the brunt. Something's going to give at some point, and it can get very ugly very fast. Without doing gloom, I want to invite Bogdan Ferenc to talk about those progressive forces that are so needed and the political change that is brewing in the country. There is a lot of solidarity and a lot of mutual support and a lot of political unity, not necessarily maybe in the ways that some of us who study parties and movements will recognize. But there is material solidarity amongst Ukrainians, not even in a kind of regionalized way like it was in 2014-15, but an all-national grassroots. And there is a lot that can be done with that. Into this immediate liquidation phase, direct payments to households. People have maxed out all of their credit cards. They borrowed from their friends, shared whatever leftover clothes, food, preserves they had in their houses. That is running out. And that will need to be plugged in. One of the things that we see not happening like it did previously is the Marshall Plan that existed after the Second World War. Of course, that was designed for after the war. And one of the things that we hear around the Lugano conference conversation, well, Lugano and then now London Recovery Conference, is that we need to plan so when the war is over, we can do it, right? But we do not know when the war will be over. And there is this normalization of it being a lengthy war, and I'm so glad, Luke, that you so well talked about it. That this can last for quite some time. I really hope it doesn't, but something needs to be done now. There are talks about the lost generation, and there are kids who, there were two wars in Ukraine. This is the all-out war, but there was a war since 2014. And there is regional variation to how heavily various areas have been impacted, and also any sort of like plans for recovery will need to include that kind of regional variation. And some scholars look at that. politicians, some try to kind of not even talk about, because it's this, again, it is so immense, the task, that it's difficult to get to wrap your head around it. But if we do not plan for also that, because we are talking about victory meaning full liberation of Ukraine's constitutional borders. Okay, there are areas that have been under Russian occupation since 2014. The integration of them, it will not be the same as those who have been under Russian occupation for a year. There is a whole generation of children who grew up watching Russian propaganda TV. What are we going to do with them? Those are very complicated and difficult tasks. But of course, the economic burden of the regions that have been depleted economically and de-developed completely. So Ukraine already altogether as a country was suffered economically since it became its own state in 1991. There's been defunding in the development of public services and infrastructure and the rest of it. There has been a huge accumulation of household and state debt that came with all sorts of conditionalities of fiscal austerity that comes for the government. And that conditionality is still in place. And that needs to be removed. If you have the most well-meaning people come into power, then you will need to have large public spending. If you have to do budgetary austerity, you will not get growth. Ukraine will need vast investment in its infrastructure, in its public services, direct payments to households. From that will come consumer demand. And it needs wage-led growth, and it needs nurturing own industries. It needs prioritization of domestic producers. Domestic producers in all sorts of different sectors, but especially in infrastructure and construction. They are there now, and they are doing what they have been doing. Liquidation services, suppliers of materials for them. Before foreign investors come, there are those who are doing stuff there. But also domestic Ukrainian industry, small, medium enterprises, large scale, they are interested in that economy working. They're interested more in it working on a long-term basis rather than ripping off a bit of profit and then taking it somewhere else. And then it leads me to another issue, the issue of offshoring of revenue. That will need to be addressed. If Ukraine is to see multiplier growth, there will need to be change of rules about how investment functions, how joint stock companies operate. There will need to be some sort of capital control, some sort of transparency of accountancy. Because if there is foreign donor and investor money being put into recovery, and then it instantly through transfer pricing or some sort of otherwise value chain schemes, it just ends up in Cyprus or Cayman Islands, then that's not good, is it? It's not going to generate growth. We also know that. So all of those complicated questions will need to be answered. But it will have to start with the main client of all of those reforms, and that is an average person. And the socio-economic system in which they live. From an impoverished mother to a sole trader, to an enterprise, to a worker in construction, to various sectoral ecosystems in Ukraine, and socio ecosystems in which all of these function. All of that will need to work in a coordinated way, and Ukrainian industry will have to be will have to lead that. And we also have this talks about it being sustainable and low carbon and the rest of it. Well, let's invest in sectors that are low carbon from the outset. Care economy, preservation of environment, public services. There can be prosperity without ecocide. There can be growth without destruction. And with that, with the direct payments to households, for example, that was one of the successful lessons from Marshall Plan. Households spend in the community. They generate trade, they generate exchange around themselves, and it deals with all sorts of what's known as social illnesses, delinquency, all sorts of abuse, violence, you name it. That's what's going to need to be happening. And there is excellent research in our research center and elsewhere that shows that that kind of investment pays for itself. And with the grassroots mobilization that we have and with channeling that investment where the needs are, rather than being just purely profit-driven, there can be prosperous Ukraine being rebuilt. I really hope, and some days it's more difficult than the other, that can happen. But for that, there should be political will internationally and on the domestic level. I'm going to stop at that and pass the word to Andriy. Thank you all for your attention.
It's obviously very difficult to step in such a meaningful contribution and lots of important matters that have been discussed. I will start maybe with just emphasizing the amount of gratitude that we have for everyone that was involved and spent the whole day discussing these things and matters and issues and challenges that are basically essential for Ukraine's survival. I know only from sort of behind the scenes, and I've seen snippets of the amount of work that went into organizing everything from the admin side. So again, very much thank you from Brussels to the time and hours you put in to gather everyone and start this reflection, which gets back to me perhaps to two things, because I think one of the crucial importance of all that is happening is that it's not wasted. This momentum is not wasted. I think for Ukraine and for all of us, it's pretty much a do or die moment where you would not be able to redo anything. This is the moment where we could still mold Ukraine's future around certain modalities that you think that will make it resilient, prosperous democracy, and you will not be given another chance. It's simply impossible. So for that not to go to waste, I think what Uwe mentioned at the very beginning, the word responsibility, I would like to focus and maybe end on it. I think clearly on the side of the EU and the progressives such as FEPS, there's a feeling of responsibility to get the Ukrainian voices involved. Obviously, you have a Ukrainian organizing a project called Progressive Path to Rebuild Ukraine. You have Ukrainian voices present today in the discussion. I think it's a tragedy that it took this amount of death and sort of unfathomable pain to have that opening where there's no longer Russian voice representing Ukrainian sort of side. But we have that opening, and it's important that it's taken on board, and it's very important that also, for instance, PEPS is actively working with partners to have it partner-driven and have all the time that Ukrainian perspective very much included. Now, I think it's also maybe sometimes not mentioned, but being a Ukrainian, it's for me, I make it personal a bit, it's very difficult to be part of the discussions when I know that sort of my fellow countrymen are sitting in trenches and fighting that war which Luke mentioned. It's emotionally taxing, to be frank, but I also know that on my side, I think we have this intellectual responsibility to make sure that the people who are going through 9 circles of hell, they are not entering the 10th when the war stops at some point. And I think it's very important that people who are now, they are focused on making sure the country survives, the nation, the children have a future. And we have this responsibility as Ukrainians, but also as Europeans, everyone who supports that Ukraine, and making sure that once they return from the war, and even when the war is fought, they don't have to fight another war once the military confrontation stops, or the high intensity, as Rukh mentioned, is over, because at some point is over. And that brings me to maybe to sum up, which we as FEPS very much hope that this is just a beginning of a process which will lead to also concrete results and have a certain discussions that you have heard a lot of important points mentioned today. But on the project side, or the framework that we've tried to set up to support Ukraine and make it sort of a resilient democratic state that take care of its citizens, we want to continue that. And we hope that this is just at the beginning of very intellectually challenging but also stimulating work. And together with our partners, with Yuliya, with Rukh, we will still be sort of putting the final touches perhaps on the framework we want to have. But I think the important is to say that there's a lot of energy and sort of willingness to make sure this progressive voices and this important matters, they enter the debate. Because as long as the momentum is still here, we should voice these concerns as much as possible, and these are present. And again, just to finalize, as Uwe mentioned, perhaps can open the Brussels bubble, but I think that many doors are opening. Again, the unfortunate thing is that a lot of people have to give their lives and to go through this tragedy. But as long as the doors are open, this needs to be a certain message that needs to be present all the time. So I think I'll finish on that, and hopefully, if you're interested in any sort of work we do, there's the books. There's nowadays easily going to the website. There are publications and other activities that could be traced. So I will not focus on that because it was a long day, and I think everyone also deserves a break at the end. But then again, thank you, and I hope that we continue this very soon, and that is successful in the end, our effort.
Yes, thank you very much. I really hope so. I think one of the, as we had also a collaborative workshop during the day today, and the idea was precisely to sort of bring those who understand the problematic of this war, the problems that Ukrainians are facing, those who are in the field, with those who know how macroeconomic policy works, not the stuff that doesn't remember that there is no such thing as externalities or that what happens in household matters, but those who understand that economy is a very complex system where a lot of important things stay outside of the spreadsheets, and to try to work out actually costed projections of how one cannot afford to not invest in Ukrainian households, in Ukrainian industry, because if recovery is to happen, if there is to be an economic growth, there needs to be that investment. And talking about deregulation, what is already poorly regulated business, is not going to generate that growth. It's going to create a big mess, right? So we will work together in the coming months to put that kind of effort of understanding understanding where the needs are of individuals, of communities, of cities, of industries, of workers, of those different important economic agents, and looking at what kind of investment mapping, what kind of institutional mapping, financing mapping is needed to make all of those work towards the success, so that Ukrainian people are dying for can be built for its future children. So I'm really grateful for this support, and I'm looking forward to see where it will, what will materialize of it. And then indeed with those concrete policy proposals, going to politicians and showing that this is the way of using the support that you are giving us in the most cost-effective, prudent, and beneficial way. We have a little bit of time. I wish we had more time for discussion, but I think there will be some questions in the room. So I want to give this opportunity, use this opportunity to let our audience ask any questions or clarifications that they might have to any of the speakers. So please, this is your opportunity now. Right, we have one hand here, and I would also ask those who have questions to please introduce yourself to the audience, who you are, because some people know each other, some people don't, and it's quite good. Can you please start?
I'm Anastasia. Thank you for your discussion. It was marvelous. So, to what extent do you think the democratic institutions in Ukraine, for instance, are being efficient in terms of holding the government to account, for instance, and ensuring the efficient representation of the proletariat of the people?
Is this a question to anybody specific, or just generally, whoever wants to take it? Okay. Thank you very much, Anastasia. We have a question over here, please.
Yeah, Mateusz Piotrowski, Europe Patients Association. So, just a comment on what Uwe has said, and maybe an argument that lands quite well at least when we think in Brussels and different places, is that the recovery in my country, in Poland, happened in a very different geopolitical circumstances, and there was a considerable backlash. So, yeah, against the neoliberal reforms. So now imagine that recovery is done with disregard to, you know, the livelihoods of common Ukrainians. What kind of backlash we will see in a country filled with guns after the war, and with people with lots of people with PTSD. So this is an argument which is, of course, based on common ethics, but it's also based on some kind of pragmatic understanding that is there in Brussels. I very much agree that such a backlash in such a big country on the European border, like, it's going to be very different than what happened in Yugoslavia after the war. Like, the scale, the sheer scale will be just, and yeah, just putting this on the table. And maybe one thing you can comment on, that Europe was used quite a lot, or the European Union, but again, there are big divergences in terms of attitudes to Ukraine, the war, recovering within the European Union, and maybe you could speak to that. And thank you for excellent discussion.
Thank you very much, Mateusz. We have a...
Hello, I work for actually INGO, and we are working with several women organizations in Ukraine. Some of them have the understanding of what's going on with this recovery plan, but some of them are not, and they understand that they need this capacity building to understand fully what's going on and austerity and the implications of the recovery plan and so on. But they find it very challenging to do it, to self-train or to do any training, external training, while attending many things, and the many things that they are doing 24 hours, 7 days a week. So I don't know, I mean, how we can break silos and bridge together people working at this community level with these conversations that are very necessary.
Thank you very much. Oksana.
Hello, yes, I'm hopping between 3 different events today and bringing a wealth of analysis. And here I can at least breathe normally, because I was this morning at a Chatham House event where I rightly asked the question about, possible backlash against the capital. And then I was at an event on gender equality and gender inclusion. And the understanding from my conversations informally is that it's already obvious from the way this conference is organized that there's resistance towards kind of more robust inclusion of civil society on the Ukrainian side. And then as a civil society activist, the logical next step is, well, we have to rely on our international partners and, kind of come through that way and maybe use foreign governments as a pressure. At the same time, what we're seeing is that the governments in countries where we are trying to build alliances are also becoming increasingly more neoliberal and, kind of turning towards the right in their own politics. And as it turned out, the reason why it was so difficult to get civil society was not only the Ukrainian side, it was also the British government putting a block on it and prioritizing private sector. So my question or reflection is that it seems almost that it's a question of alliances and solidarities, and where it makes sense to actually try to have a leverage, because we are looking at, liberalization or right-wingization of governments all across Europe as well, in places where we would think that we have logical support, but not necessarily. So it's a reflection and an open question about, where do we look for these alliances?
I thought you'd give us the answer, but...
Sorry. I think at least I'm voicing the question, is it therapeutic for me? Because I'm walking with it desperately all day. I was like, oh my God, it looks hopeless.
Well, you were at certain events. We have a hand at the back, please.
Hello, my name is Fidanka. I come from Bulgaria. I agree with a lot of what was said, particularly what Uwe was saying. Just at the end about building alliances, I completely disagree with the idea that the socialists in the Brussels bubble can be an ally. I mean, I come from Bulgaria, where socialists in the 80s, in the 90s, in the noughties were not allies. I mean, we can see socialists in Italy, socialists in Greece, who are very, very, very pro-Russian. We have our socialists marching for peace, read neutrality. We have socialists in our governments who are against military or other aid to Ukraine. So I can see how these kind of socialists are gonna be like our allies. So I'm coming to the same question as Oksana. Like, for me, left and right are now united against Ukraine, pro-Russia in many countries. And we are really kind of a bit stuck in the middle, like in the center. I mean, sometimes Greens, but Greens are also neoliberal nowadays. So where do we go? I don't know.
It's a very good question. I call it anti-imperialism of amoral idiots. But we can talk about that later. I think I saw a hand there, and then I'm going to come back.
And over here is one.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that. I'm just going in the order of their appearance. Yes.
For me. So I have rather some maybe to say some words in order to contribute to discussion, but it's maybe 1, 2, or 3 minutes. So I'm dealing with Ukrainian economy, and namely with the industry sector of Ukraine now. And so there are some words that has symbolic sense for Ukraine and must be maybe rethinked. For example, regulation for Ukraine. As for me, in Ukraine, we have less regulation than in European Union, to be the truth. So my friend from the Belgium, which are businessman, has told me, I love Ukraine to do business in Ukraine because you have a much less regulation than in Europe. So what we need now is not so much the regulation in Ukraine, but the adaptation to the European Union regulation. And that's a huge works, which a lot of works, which we do have now ahead. So a lot of program must be designed in order to assist Ukraine to enter and to meet the standards. And the second one, this oligarch in Ukraine. We must understand that now oligarchs are much more weaker than before. For example, steel. Ukraine have some oligarchs in steel sector. I will not give the name. All of you know that. But we have produced before war 21 million tons of steel, and this production have supplied a lot of job for a lot of people. More than 100,000 people work in steel sector. So we must be careful. We'll speak about Ukraine oligarch. Oligarch must not be extricated or wiped away. It's very necessary for oligarch to become the businessman in Ukraine. But now this process is going on. So we have produced 21 million tons of steel. This year we were expected about 6.5 million steel. But after destruction of Kakhovka pools, where our steel producing enterprise get technical water for the working process, we expect 4, not 3.5 and 4 million. So this is a very heavy strike for Ukrainian economy. And we must say, and also the process which are now arranged by big business, Ukraine need big business also. When we do have a lot of big enterprise, then we have also a lot of small and medium enterprise, because they will get job being integrated in the value chains for this big enterprise also. So now we must be carefully, because this big enterprise which now works in Ukraine also play important role for Ukrainian economy. So, but oligarch much became businessmen, ordinary businessmen in Ukraine, and this process is now going on. And but final words, what we need now for Ukraine is to support the inner market, because domestic market is very weak now. So, and what we are looking for maybe to compensate partially through the export. And so we are now asking our foreign partners to buy more product from Ukraine. instead of buying this product from aggressor Russia, for example. And also in this situation, all of us like market, and so market economy. And Ukraine, our market economy will be market economy, free market, and we are very fond of this liberal economy and economic freedom. But in this situation, state must play more important role, because there are more market failure during the wartime. This is a historical phenomenon. So now the role of state is a big buyer of the product from private sector. So when the state is a buyer, private sector will produce in such way the state power will support the private sector. And this private sector will play a very big role in the future. And so that's some remark concerning the present economical situation in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are very, very important. And I would, yeah, no, there are two more. Yeah, I'm going to refrain from engaging in a conversation, but we can continue that later. Yes, please, let's collect the questions.
I'm working for Greenwich and I'm Ukrainian. Actually, my question is partially continuation of the previous one. So today in the news we saw the statements from the Ministry of Economy about the views of the economy in Ukraine in the future and the priorities which they see for the development. And this is kind of in a way, half and half business as usual, the boom of agriculture, the renewables plus nukes altogether, mix as usual, industrial transition in a way, in a green, but still, then lithium, titanium extraction. So how this, from our point of view, this is kind of contradictory questions and too much, I don't know, optimistic and elsewhere. So how, from the point of view of the economy, actually, this is seen? Is it realistic? Is it? What's your opinion on that?
Thank you very much. And we had a hand.
Hi everyone. Sorry as well for coming late, but I come from the Building and Woodworkers International, a global union federation with HQ in Geneva. And we represent around 12 million workers from our affiliates. And one of our very active affiliates is a Ukrainian affiliate called Rukh from the construction sector. And I just want to maybe answer the socialists, maybe not be on our side. We're not politically bound organization, but what we can see is that the trade unions have made a very clear position in the war, and also working very hard to push their governments to put on safeguards on the loans and the money that's coming in. I'm very happy to be at the backwatchers here. I personally worked for the last 5 years with the World Bank and the safeguards policies of the different IFIs. And what we can see is that something we really will have to work on is to include decent work in these commitments, because it's not on anyone's agenda. I'm sure you've discussed it already, but even if you look back at the Lugano principles, what was missing was the workers. And we highlighted it to the safeguards teams and they're surprised themselves, which is quite funny, but also how to ensure that the construction that's going to be done will be done as decent work, but also paid and formalized. Because what we see right now is everyone trying to push that, oh, the community just want to reconstruct themselves. But it needs, if you want to build a formal economy, it needs to be formal work, and you need to compensate and ensure that the skills are there. So I think these are two topics that I'm happy if anyone wants to come and discuss it more in detail. But just to give some hope is that the trade union movement in the world is very strong supporters, and yes, we're losing social democrats to neoliberal policies often, but this is a very clear stand. And I think it's something that we should really push together, because where the leverage is going to be on the reconstruction is at the international financial institutions. And we need to keep focus that they will also be able to push the government to do pretty much whatever, because the commitment is coming with the money. And if we can come with the safeguards and in the procurement policies, we're not going to be able to change the laws that quickly, but in the procurement, we can actually have an influence on what's happening. So that's just the direction.
Thank you so much. That's a very, I'm sorry I had to a bit run out, but it's a very important comment. And indeed, procurement is one way of monitoring these things. And we have great scholars actually also at this university who specifically look at how through procurement direction of financing can be channeled where it's, say, more socially beneficial, to put it kind of broadly. Yes, please.
Right. May I expand on that last?
Yes, sure.
Comment, respond a little bit. My name is Brian Milikovsky. I work for a USAID-funded program in Ukraine on economic resilience. We recently did a conference in Kyiv and online, in which Vasil Andreev from Rukh took part. So we were very happy that he was there, and he raised a lot of these issues. We were talking about insourcing the recovery, like ensuring that the reconstruction process in Ukraine engages its domestic economy, as Volodymyr was talking about, and others. And this question of course, decent work. Vasil brought this up.
He should have been here with me today, but he didn't get his visa.
Didn't get his visa.
Sorry.
That stinks. He brought that up, and it made me think that what we see a tendency, I've talked about this a lot last couple of days with a lot of people here at different events, that the European Union is going to put certain money that are more about actually what gets built with building materials. And it's a long story. That's either a very big opportunity for Ukraine to start building materials like manufacturers in the EU, or it's a massive way for the EU to get into Ukraine's own economy. That's a different question. But those are conditions imported from European Union's legislative framework into Ukraine. The European Union has certain decent work requirements in its own legislative framework. It could easily tie to the money the same way it's doing with conditions about the building materials.
And maybe a super short addition to that. An ally that wasn't predicted by many is actually the European construction companies, because they want to win the contracts and they know that they cannot compete with the Chinese multinationals on price, etc. So they want the standards and the safeguards to be higher, because they know then they can win the procurement. So you can also find very strange alternative allies through these ways of pushing on labor rights as a higher one. Because the fact is that the Ukrainian, how much we talk about the internal market, the Ukrainian companies will not win the contracts because they're too small. So they will be the subcontractors, and therefore we really need to start looking at how can we also make sure that the subcontracting is controlled in a good way, because that's where the work for the Ukrainian companies will come. So we have many levels there.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to give it to him now in a second. But that also, you know, it's a very complex terrain here, because perhaps what we need is the state construction company, so that it can get the contracts and build housing and infrastructure that is not costing the earth, but is large scale, local, and affordable. Because Ukraine does not have a lot of money to spare and won't for a little while. So it's also being very prudent with whatever we have is also very important, because the tasks are enormous. But also building capacity in the country is very important for sustainable development, economic and otherwise. Uwe, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I think you won't find it in many places. The question, maybe for us in this event, but the question also at the end of the day for the Ukrainian population is, where is the leverage? How can we build alliances? And I mean, we have to be realistic. The majority of the professionals in the international financial institutions are the same people who did what we don't like and what has not worked. But for them, it won't be easy to change, and they only will change if there is a pressure organized. So I'm not here to defend socialists because they are socialists, but I mean, judge them by what they are doing. So I think at this point of the championship, it's not so much an ideological question. And that's why I liked a lot this indication of the procurement processes, yeah, where we suddenly might have allies which normally are perceived as adversaries. So, but this is all open still. So it is really important that we keep the debate going that's going on here. And then we need to look for decision makers who can be the transmission belt into politics. Because otherwise, I mean, it's the trouble very often today is that political consultancy, think tanks, a certain intellectual community, which is really dedicated, knows what would have to be done. But it is not done because there is no transmission into politics. Take climate change, and we know what we would have to do to at least cope with it, but it's not done because it's not possible to organize the transition into politics. And the same thing I would say we have here. The good thing is the moment we're in. It's still early, and I can only encourage ourselves and others to keep these debates going and then really go for a different transition. This is a second transition of Ukraine. The first transition didn't work because you had more losers than winners. But we also have to see that neoliberalism had one side effect, which turns out to be positive in this war. I mean, that was exactly what Putin didn't understand. He didn't understand the Ukrainian society, where there were many people who had learned under hard capitalist conditions to survive, take the initiative, take decisions, which was not the case in Soviet times. Nobody took decisions, nobody decided anything. They tried to flee from this because you could only be punished for that. In a hard capitalist environment, as I would say in Ukraine, you had a neoliberal environment over the last years, individuals were forced to do this. This temporarily turns into an advantage, but the biggest advantage, in my opinion, is the solidarity that people are now feeling with each other and the determination that they only can survive when they organize collectively. And this collective element, I think one has to safeguard and to try to save it into peace times, which is not easier. I would not admit I have any recipes, but I mean, we do have experiences with transitions and post-war situations in the Balkans, recent experiences. I mean, there we should listen to colleagues and comrades in the Balkans, what they experienced and what they did. In the Balkans, many things have not functioned. And one last sentence regarding the stakeholders in reconstruction recovery. I keep up my argument that the EU will pay the biggest share, because the Americans have other things to do, and we don't even know how the US looks like after the next election. So at the end of the day, the American economy benefits from Europe being over-engaged with Ukraine, because this directs investments into a direction which cannot be competitive investments to the US. So I think at the end of the day, this is basically a European matter. The UK comes into this, but after Brexit, it comes into this in a very different way from as if it would be still a member of the European Union. Okay, I stop here, but honestly speaking, I think it's still a time where we can shape certain things, and we should do it pragmatically and not ideologically. But if we do that, we will find out anyway that progressives will be the ones who take responsibility and the other ones want to make money on reconstruction.
Thank you very much, Uwe. I think it was also a really great way of addressing this variety and wealth of questions and points that were raised. And I want to second what you said about who are the socialists and who to build alliance with. Well, we in Ukraine also know very well that people who call themselves socialists are not necessarily socialists. Up until recently, we had quite a few parties who were in the pocket of oligarchs and called themselves socialists. We're familiar. So we need to look at what people do, and not necessarily kind of how, you need to also kind of look at what they call themselves, because some are quite open about being from the very rather unpleasant side of the political spectrum. But at the same time, it's those who pragmatically really want to cooperate with you, work with you, and help you. That's with who we need to be working. And those who are so stuck into their own confused version of the only one bit of Russian revolution, well, let's send them to the library, unless you want to send them somewhere further, because they've gone so dark red, they're brown. That's reference to fascist. It is. If you're enabling fascism, you're a fascist in my book. So, yeah, and Russia is fascist according to Russian dissidents. So take it on their authority if you don't want to take it from Ukrainian. I'm going to, very sadly...
There's a point from God. Do you want to take it? I can read it if you want, or... Very insightful.
Oh, yes, please, let's read it out. And I'm going to give a one-sentence opportunity to the panel to respond. Because we're running over time.
And they have to reproduce their label power.
If I give them one sentence, they're going to speak for 3 minutes. So
it's quite a long sentence.
I've been chairing before. Yes, do you? Shall I read it out? So there is a comment in the chat from Gal Rakover. I hope I didn't butcher that name. Which
PhD student. The correct pronunciation.
Okay. It was published by that the reconstruction financing will be run by BlackRock and JP Morgan. Oh yes, not run, but they're in it. Yeah. With BlackRock's Brandon Hall quoted as saying initial investment will come through a de-risking mechanism. What are the implications? Are there alternatives? And if so, why is this option? Why is this option the one pursued by the Ukrainian leadership?
You have discussed that.
I think we sort of did. I think we also need to have a separate event altogether on financing, because there are so many different actors and different pools involved that answering that will be unfeasible. Not least, I think the question as to why Ukrainian government pursues that and not something else, unless we are privy to certain conversations, involves an element of guessing. And perhaps it's a bit of an ungrateful exercise, especially on record, but generally, kind of social astrology is not to be encouraged. Dear panelists, who would like to come back to any of the points that were raised and address them in ideally a brief manner? in whichever order that you would like.
If no one's going to it, and because we're losing time here,
Well, yeah.
shall I jump in?
Go.
Okay, so I'll just say two things. One, on alliances and neoliberalism, Oksana's question, I would tend to be a bit more optimistic. So I think over the last 15 years, there has been a move away in many countries from neoliberalism. At the centre of that is the Biden administration. We've just heard from Brian at the back. Is sort of related to the Biden administration about how we need an industrial strategy for Ukraine. What that industrial strategy is roughly doing is trying to implement what the Americans call the Buy American policy. We need a Buy Ukrainian policy to insource not only the future recovery but the war economy in Ukraine. And even back here in Europe, and we're still in Europe, I would still tend to be a bit more optimistic. I mean, sure, the Bulgarian Socialist Party should have been expelled from the Party of European Socialists many years ago. It is a scandal that they are still there. They are essentially a far-right party. But elsewhere, there's a progressive government in Spain that has given a lot of support to Ukraine. I know people like to have a go at Germany, but at the end of the day, through quite a difficult internal debate, it's a progressive government that supported Ukraine. And then lastly, I just wanted to come back to what Anastasia said actually about democracy and risks, but also Bogdan in his contribution, because I think, if you're looking at the drivers of authoritarianization, which is one of my research interests, what we should be saying to the Ukrainian government, I think, is that if you destroy the social basis of your economy in a war and a future recovery, then you're going to face some form of Trump problem. In your best case scenario, your institutions survive and you just have an authoritarian leader who's very, very nationalist. In your worst case scenario, your institutions don't survive, and that's where you get to that intractable war and conflict situation.
Thank you very much, Luke. Tasha?
Okay, I will also...
Bogdan, does this speak directly to what Luke said? Because I could then give you a word. I do not mind. Yeah? Because I think you're speaking to the same stuff, so it kind of makes sense conversationally. Yes, sorry, Tasha, didn't mean to.
No problem.
Please, Bogdan.
Yes, thanks a lot, Luke. It was a pleasure to meet you in Kyiv. And I totally agree with you that we should just realize, as I mentioned, that somebody had to do this kind of work that Yuliya mentioned, just to build, to repair, and to fight for the social justice here in Ukraine. And we are weak usually, unfortunately. I mean, trade unions and leftist organizations. You can see that representations of the civil society from Ukraine now at the London conference. Only I know Ivan from Cedos is participating as a speaker. I mean, from the more progressive stand. But it's like a predominantly liberal discourse, and it means that we together we have to be more visible, more influential, and more active at political level after the end of war, especially. And last but not least, this kind of discussions we need to have in Ukraine. And my opinion is that this kind of articles, this kind of opinions, we also need to have here in Ukraine in different universities. Because maybe we can discuss some kind of translation of some articles also into Ukrainian language, because it's not enough only just to have this abroad. It's necessary to have discussions, activities, and real actions here in Ukraine. And we will be happy to help all of the initiatives together with STEPS, with Healthcare, and other progressive think tanks, with social democrats in the European Parliament. Thanks a lot.
IPS have kindly translated my article in Insourcing the War Economy into Ukrainian, so I hope it's helpful.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. And you see already alliances are being built. We are at an alliance building events. We've been doing that all day and we're making more of them. And I think sometimes things that we ourselves do, we do not notice as much. Let's do more of it. More noticing and more building. Like sometimes what we're looking for is kind of in front of us. We need to extend it a bit and, you know, don't despair. Tasha, please.
I will be short. Also, only two things about the decent work. It's a topic we work a lot with before the war, during the war, so I would like to talk about it for hours, but now I would say that I think, unfortunately now, what we see in the recovery plans is that decent work is seen somehow as an obstacle to economic development. And this is, I think, I see a lot of contradiction in this. And I think it's the one thing we should address in our advocacy. Second thing is that if decent work is addressed, which is really a rare case, even if we check the recovery plans, like a sectoral recovery plans, it's really rare to mention workers of energetics or workers of care sector or healthcare sector. It's really rare. But if it's addressed, it's usually about wages. But it's almost never about work conditions, about the safety, for example. During the war, the labor inspection is almost frozen. So inspection, which responsibility is to check construction sites and other. You know, there are a lot of issues with work conditions besides construction. So safety is missed somehow, and in general, the decent work as a thing, as a goal, is not presented in the sectoral politics at all. For instance, youth politics. I think it's also important because a lot of young people in Ukraine have never been officially employed. So they started their work as self-employed or working in the informal economy. You know, and this is completely missing. What we will do with this generation, even like how will trade unions do their organizing with people who are self-employed from 16 years? Also, I think this is like a big thing to address. And the second thing I would like to say is I actually slightly disagree with trying to find any positive outcomes in neoliberalism and neoliberal politics. And I think we need to be very cautious with that, especially when saying that this hard realities of the 90s and all this economic hardship in neoliberalism make Ukrainian society resilient. Because neoliberalism is not about solidarity, it's about individualization of life risk and competing with each other. So I slightly doubt how this can make us resilient nation. I actually believe, but that's my opinion, that exactly because neoliberalism has never gone so far in Ukraine, we somehow managed to preserve this society, this social cohesion. Because even considering all the problems with democracy in Russia, I still think that Russian society is much more automized, not only because of the autocracy, but also because that neoliberalism went too far in Russia in compared to Ukraine. So I think at least in this room, we should be very cautious with saying that, you know, for some years, for some period, neoliberalism is not so bad. Because there are a lot of people who will say it, they don't need our support, I think.
I think this is an excellent point at which to complete this meeting. There is loads of food for thought. We would need to stay here for a few more days at least to get to so much as the kind of depth, some sort of depth of the surface of many of the issues that were raised. But that again shows us exactly how important these topics are, how deeply they, how deeply we feel they need to be discussed, how urgent they are, and I look forward to more of it. But for now, please do take the books. Read more, follow what we do. There will be more of it coming, and I'm just going to pass over to Andrei for any concluding message you may have to.
Yes, only one word: hope. To leave on a positive note. First, I think Considering what time we have of people being really exhausted, but the intensity did not drop, and I hardly find this in any sort of other type of discussions. And the other thing is, if you look, remember, there's no jets, no tanks, no membership for the EU, and still Ukraine sort of persists and progresses. So we should keep an open eye for that. And I just finish on one actor that is very sort of symbolic of what we have today, Ukrainian diaspora. And you look for the amount of people that will be present and deeply embedded within the societies throughout Europe and beyond. And they will have their own structures, they will have their own ways. So I think there's a lot of hope also and potential too for them.
Thank you so much, Andrei. Thank you. Sorry, we didn't get to absolutely all of them, but they are an excellent food for thought, and let's continue these conversations. Again, follow this space, and let's stay in touch and let's build those networks. You know where to find us. Wonderful to meet you. Thank you for coming and joining us here today.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.